The morning mist clung to Boston Harbor like a shroud of uncertainty. As Captain John Parker adjusted his musket strap and gazed across the colonial landscape that would soon be baptized in blood, it was April 18th, 1775, and the winds of revolution were stirring through the Massachusetts countryside with an intensity that made even the most loyal British subjects question their allegiances. Parker, a veteran of the French and Indian War, had seen his share of conflict, but nothing had prepared him for the tension that now gripped the 13 colonies. The British Parliament's relentless taxation and the recent passage of the Intolerable Acts had pushed the colonists to their breaking point. What had begun as peaceful protests and boycotts was rapidly evolving into something far more dangerous. In the dim candlelight of Buckman Tavern, the colonial militia leaders huddled around rough-hewn tables, their voices barely above whispers as they discussed intelligence reports filtering in from Boston. Samuel Adams and John Hancock, two of the most wanted men in Massachusetts, were reportedly hiding in nearby Lexington, their very presence a magnet for British military action. The Sons of Liberty had been stockpiling weapons and gunpowder in Concord, just 20 miles from Boston, creating a powder keg that threatened to explode at any moment. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith of the British Army had received his orders directly from General Thomas Gage, the military governor of Massachusetts. The mission was straightforward in theory, but treacherous in execution. March to Concord under cover of darkness, seize the rebel weapons cache, and capture Adams and Hancock if possible. Smith understood that failure was not an option. The British Empire's grip on its most rebellious colony hung in the balance. As news of British troop movements began to circulate through Boston's network of Patriot spies, Paul Revere and William Dawes prepared for what would become one of history's most famous midnight rides. The Colonial Intelligence Network, far more sophisticated than the British had imagined, was already mobilizing to warn the countryside of the approaching danger. Church bells would soon toll across Massachusetts, not in celebration, but as harbingers of war. The stage was set for a confrontation that neither side fully anticipated would alter the course of human history. British soldiers, many of whom had served with distinction in Europe and India, prepared their equipment with professional efficiency, unaware that they were about to face an enemy unlike any they had encountered before. These colonial militiamen, derided as amateur farmers playing as soldier, possessed something the professional British Army had not fully comprehended. They were fighting for their homes, their families, and their vision of freedom, according to historical accounts documented in David Hackett Fisher's comprehensive study Paul Revere's Ride. The colonial resistance movement had spent months preparing for this moment, establishing communication networks and supply routes that would prove crucial in the coming conflict. The meticulous planning of both sides created conditions for a collision that would reverberate across continents and centuries. Captain Parker knew that his 7-7 militiamen were vastly outnumbered by the approaching British force of nearly 800 regulars. Yet as he watched his neighbors and friends check their weapons and ammunition, he saw a determination that transcended mere military mathematics. These men were not professional soldiers, but they possessed something perhaps more powerful, the conviction that they were defending principles worth dying for, principles that would soon be enshrined in documents that would inspire oppressed peoples around the world. The darkness of April 18 seemed particularly profound as Paul Revere received the signal he had been anxiously awaiting. The lanterns flickered in the steeple of Old North Church, confirming his worst fears. The British regulars were crossing the Charles River by boat, not marching overland via Boston Neck. This meant they intended to reach Lexington and Concord with maximum speed and surprise, hoping to complete their mission before the colonial militia could organize effective resistance. Revere's horse thundered through the night, hooves striking cobblestones and dirt roads with urgent rhythm as he carried his warning to every patriot household between Boston and Lexington. Behind him, William Dawes took an alternate route, ensuring that even if one messenger was captured, the alarm would still reach its destination. The Colonial Intelligence Network, dismissed by British officers as a collection of amateur conspirators, was demonstrating organizational capabilities that would have impressed European military strategists. Dr. Samuel Prescott, a young physician returning from courting his sweetheart in Lexington, joined Revere and Dawes near midnight, adding local knowledge and credibility to their desperate mission. The three riders split up to cover more ground, knowing that every minute counted as Lieutenant Colonel Smith's column advanced through the Massachusetts countryside. British patrols had been deployed to intercept messengers, creating a deadly game of cat and mouse in the pre-dawn darkness. When Revere was captured by a British patrol near Lexington, he had already delivered his message to enough colonial leaders to set the resistance network in motion. Church bells began ringing across the countryside, joined by drum beats and signal fires that transformed the peaceful agricultural landscape into a military communication system of remarkable efficiency. Farmers left their beds to retrieve muskets that had hung over fireplaces since the French and Indian War, while their wives prepared bandages and medical supplies with grim determination. Captain John Parker assembled his Lexington militia on the town common as the first gray light of dawn began to creep across the horizon. These men, ranging in age from 16 to 60, represented a cross-section of colonial society: farmers, blacksmiths, merchants, and laborers united by their shared opposition to British policies they considered tyrannical. Parker's own cousin, Jonas Parker, stood among the militia despite his advanced age, embodying the multi-generational nature of the colonial resistance movement. The British column, led by Major John Pitcairn of the Royal Marines, approached Lexington. With confidence born of professional military training and superior numbers, Pitcairn, a veteran officer respected by both his men and colonial civilians, had hoped to complete the mission without bloodshed. He understood that violence would likely escalate the conflict beyond any possibility of peaceful resolution, transforming what many still considered a family dispute within the British Empire into something far more serious and permanent. As documented in eyewitness accounts compiled by historian Arthur Tortellet in his work Lexington and Concord, the tension in Lexington Common was palpable as both forces faced each other in the strengthening daylight. The British regulars, resplendent in their red uniforms and equipped with the finest military technology of the era, formed precise lines that spoke of years of drill and discipline. Facing them, the colonial militia appeared almost informal by comparison, but their familiarity with the terrain and their motivation gave them advantages that would soon become apparent. Captain Parker reportedly told his men to stand their ground, but not to fire unless fired upon, recognizing that the first shot would carry implications far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The entire future of British-American relations hung in the balance, as approximately 800 British soldiers faced fewer than 80 colonial militiamen in a confrontation that neither side had actively sought, but both seemed powerless to avoid. Dawn broke over Lexington Common with deceptive tranquility, the morning mist slowly lifting to reveal to opposing forces locked in a moment that would define the next century of American history. Major John Pitcairn rode forward from the British column, his voice carrying across the open ground as he commanded the colonial militia to disperse and lay down their arms. The British officer's words were measured and professional, reflecting his hope that this confrontation might still end without violence. Captain Parker, recognizing the overwhelming numerical disadvantage his men faced, began ordering his militia to withdraw. The Lexington men, disciplined despite their civilian origins, started to comply with their commander's instructions while maintaining their grip on their muskets. This partial compliance created a confused situation where some militiamen were leaving the common, while others remained in formation, uncertain whether Parker's order constituted a complete retreat or merely a tactical repositioning. In this moment of dangerous ambiguity, with British soldiers advancing and colonial militia dispersing, the first shot erupted across Lexington Common. Historical accounts differ regarding which side fired first, with both British officers and colonial witnesses claiming the other party initiated hostilities. What remains undisputed is that this single musket shot, whether fired intentionally or accidentally, transformed a tense standoff into the opening engagement of the American Revolutionary War. The British regulars, trained to respond to gunfire with disciplined volleys, unleashed a devastating fusillade that swept across the common with deadly efficiency. Colonial militiamen, caught in the open and vastly outnumbered, found themselves exposed to professional military firepower that few of them had ever experienced. Jonas Parker, Captain Parker's elderly cousin, fell mortally wounded while attempting to reload his musket, becoming one of the first casualties in America's struggle for independence. Within minutes, 8 colonial militiamen lay dead on Lexington Common, with 10 others wounded by British musket balls. The brief engagement had lasted less than 15 minutes, but its implications would resonate for generations. Major Pitcairn, despite his efforts to control his men, watched in dismay as what he had hoped would be a bloodless show of force transformed into a shooting war that neither Britain nor its American colonies could easily contain. The British column reformed and continued its march toward Concord, leaving behind a scene that would be seared into American memory. The bodies of the fallen militiamen served as stark testimony to the price of resistance. But rather than intimidating the colonial population, their sacrifice galvanized opposition to British rule. Throughout Massachusetts and beyond, messengers carried news of the Lexington engagement to neighboring towns, where militia companies were already mobilizing in response to the midnight alarm, as reported in contemporary accounts analyzed by historian Robert Gross in The Minutemen and Their World. The news of bloodshed at Lexington transformed the nature of colonial resistance from political protest to armed rebellion. Communities that had previously limited themselves to boycotts and petitions now understood that their dispute with Britain had crossed a threshold from which there could be no easy return. Lieutenant Colonel Smith's force pressed on toward Concord, unaware that their brief engagement at Lexington had already begun to produce consequences far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Colonial militia companies from throughout the region were converging on Concord, turning what had been planned as a simple search and seizure operation into a potential military disaster for the British forces. The element of surprise, crucial to the mission's success, had been completely lost. Captain Parker and his surviving militiamen, bloodied but not broken, regrouped to consider their next move. The engagement at Lexington had lasted only minutes, but it had demonstrated both the vulnerability of colonial forces when caught in the open and their determination to resist British authority despite the personal cost. These lessons would prove valuable in the longer struggle that was about to unfold across the Massachusetts countryside. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith's British column approached Concord with the morning sun climbing higher in the April sky, the soldiers' red uniforms creating a stark contrast against the emerging green of spring foliage. The news of the engagement at Lexington had preceded them, carried by colonial messengers who seemed to materialize from every farmhouse in Forest Pass. What had begun as a covert operation designed to catch the rebels unprepared was rapidly transforming into a running battle against an increasingly organized and determined enemy. The British advance guard, led by Captain Lawrence Parsons, moved methodically through Concord streets while Smith deployed his main force to secure the town center and begin the search for hidden weapons and military supplies. The operation proceeded with professional efficiency as soldiers searched houses, barns, and outbuildings for evidence of the rebel arsenal that intelligence reports had indicated was stored somewhere in the community from their positions on Punkatasset Hill overlooking the town. Colonial militia companies watched the British search with growing concern and anger. Major John Buttrick of the Concord militia found himself commanding an increasingly large force. As companies from surrounding towns continued to arrive throughout the morning, these men, products of a society that valued individual initiative and local self-governance, were not easily intimidated by displays of imperial military power. The colonial force, now numbering over 400 men, observed smoke rising from the center of Concord, where British soldiers were burning military supplies they had discovered. This sight galvanized the watching militiamen, many of whom believed the British were burning the entire town rather than just confiscated weapons. The smoke served as a visual catalyst that transformed colonial observers into active participants in what was rapidly becoming a full-scale military engagement. Major Buttrick made the fateful decision to advance toward North Bridge, where a small British detachment under Captain Walter Larry had been posted to prevent colonial forces from interfering with the search operation. The 3 companies of British light infantry holding the bridge position found themselves facing a force nearly twice their size, composed of men who knew every stone wall, tree line, and creek bed in the surrounding countryside. The engagement at North Bridge erupted when Captain Laurie's men fired a warning volley over the heads of the advancing colonials, hoping to halt their approach without causing casualties. This tactical decision backfired dramatically when the colonial militia, interpreting the British fire as a hostile act, responded with disciplined volleys that struck down several British soldiers. Captain Laurie himself was wounded in the exchange, and his small force found itself overwhelmed by superior numbers and accurate colonial marksmanship. According to military historian David Hackett Fisher's detailed analysis of the engagement, the fighting at North Bridge represented a significant tactical evolution in colonial military thinking. Unlike the confused melee at Lexington, The Concord engagement demonstrated that colonial militia could execute coordinated attacks against professional British forces. When they possessed numerical superiority and favorable terrain, the British retreat from North Bridge marked the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt Lieutenant Colonel Smith's column for the remainder of the day. Colonial militiamen, no longer content to observe British movements from a distance, began to harass the withdrawing force with increasing boldness and effectiveness. The tactical advantage had shifted decisively to the colonials, who could use their intimate knowledge of local geography to strike at the British column and then disappear in the familiar terrain. Captain Parsons, returning from his search of the surrounding countryside, found his route back to the main British force blocked by colonial militia who had reoccupied North Bridge. The captain was forced to wade across the Concord River upstream from the bridge, a humiliating experience that symbolized the complete breakdown of British tactical superiority. Professional soldiers who had served with distinction in European campaigns found themselves outmaneuvered by colonial farmers who had transformed their hunting skills into military tactics. The British retreat from Concord began in the early afternoon of April 19, 1775, with Lieutenant Colonel Smith's force of nearly 800 men forming a column that stretched along the narrow country road toward Lexington. What had begun as a confident march into rebel territory 12 hours earlier was now becoming a desperate fighting withdrawal against an enemy that seemed to multiply with every passing mile. Colonial militia companies continued to arrive from throughout eastern Massachusetts, drawn by the alarm system that had spread news of the British expedition across the countryside. With remarkable speed and efficiency, these reinforcements brought the total colonial force to over 1,500 men, transforming what had been a local skirmish into a regional uprising that challenged fundamental assumptions about British military supremacy in North America. The British column moved with increasing urgency as colonial marksmen began to appear along the route, using stone walls, trees, and buildings as cover while they picked off individual soldiers with deadly accuracy. These colonial fighters, many of whom had learned their shooting skills hunting game in the dense New England forests, possessed marksmanship abilities that far exceeded those of the average British regular, who had been trained primarily for European-style battlefield engagements involving mass formations and coordinated volleys. Captain Walter Lowry, wounded at North Bridge but still commanding his company, organized rearguard actions designed to slow the colonial pursuit while the main British force attempted to maintain its formation and rate of march. These tactical maneuvers, executed with professional competence under extremely difficult circumstances, prevented Smith's column from complete disintegration but could not stop the steady attrition of men and morale that characterized the entire retreat. The engagement at Merriam's Corner marked a significant escalation in the intensity of the fighting as colonial forces launched coordinated attacks from multiple directions. While the British column attempted to cross a narrow bridge over a small creek, the confined terrain negated many of the advantages that British military discipline typically provided, while giving full scope to colonial tactical innovations that emphasized individual initiative and intimate knowledge of local geography. British casualties mounted steadily as the retreat continued, with officers particularly targeted by colonial marksmen who understood the importance of disrupting enemy command and control. Lieutenant Edward Gould of the King's Own Regiment fell mortally wounded while attempting to rally his men, joining a growing list of British casualties that included both enlisted men and junior officers. The loss of experienced leadership further complicated Smith's tactical situation as his force faced increasingly aggressive colonial attacks. The psychological pressure on the British soldiers was intensified by the nature of their opponents, who did not conform to European military conventions regarding uniforms, formations, or battlefield behavior. These colonial fighters appeared and disappeared like phantoms, striking from unexpected directions before melting back into terrain that they knew intimately, but which remained alien and threatening the British eyes. As documented in Alan French's comprehensive study The Day of Concord and Lexington, the British retreat developed characteristics of a running battle that tested military doctrines developed for European conditions against American tactical innovations born of frontier experience and local geography. The colonials' ability to maintain pressure on the retreating force while avoiding decisive engagement reflected a sophisticated understanding of asymmetric warfare that would characterize much of the subsequent Revolutionary War. Major John Pitcairn, whose Marines had performed competently throughout the expedition, found his men increasingly exhausted by the combination of physical exertion and psychological stress that defined the retreat. The British soldiers, burdened by heavy equipment and unfamiliar with the terrain, struggled to maintain the pace necessary to outrun their pursuers while fighting rearguard actions. That became increasingly desperate as colonial numbers continued to grow. The British column's cohesion began to deteriorate as individual soldiers, overcome by fatigue and fear, broke ranks to seek shelter or attempt individual escapes. This breakdown of military discipline, unthinkable under normal circumstances, reflected the extreme stress that Smith's force was experiencing as it fought its way through increasingly hostile territory toward the dubious safety of British-controlled Boston. As Lieutenant Colonel Smith's battered column approached Lexington in the late afternoon, the situation appeared increasingly desperate for the British forces. Ammunition was running dangerously low, casualties continued to mount, and the colonial pursuit showed no signs of diminishing intensity. The professional soldiers who had marched confidently from Boston 24 hours earlier were now engaged in a fighting retreat that tested every aspect of their military training and personal courage. The sound of approaching artillery provided the first indication that relief might be at hand for Smith's embattled force. Brigadier General Hugh Percy, responding to urgent messages from Boston, had marched from the city with a relief column consisting of over 1,000 fresh troops and 6-pounder cannons. Percy's timely arrival at Lexington Common represented a masterpiece of military coordination. Under extremely difficult circumstances, the junction of Smith's and Percy's forces at Lexington created a temporary respite in the fighting. As the colonial militia pulled back to assess this new development in the tactical situation, Percy's artillery pieces, positioned to command the approaches to the town center, provided the British with their first significant tactical advantage since the expedition had begun. The psychological effect of artillery fire on colonial militia, most of whom had never experienced cannon bombardment, was immediately apparent as the colonial forces withdrew to more distant positions. General Percy, a veteran officer with extensive experience in European campaigns, quickly assessed the situation and made tactical decisions that reflected both his professional competence and his understanding of the unique challenges posed by colonial fighting methods. Rather than attempting to continue the original mission to Concord, Percy recognized that his primary objective must be the safe extraction of British forces to Boston. Before the colonial opposition could become even more organized and numerous, the combined British force, now numbering over 1,800 men with artillery support, began a fighting withdrawal toward Boston that differed significantly from Smith's earlier retreat. Percy's tactical innovations included the deployment of flanking parties, the clear suspected ambush position, and the use of artillery to suppress colonial resistance. At key terrain features, these measures reduced British casualties but could not eliminate the fundamental problem of moving a large military formation through hostile territory. Controlled by an increasingly confident enemy, colonial militia commanders, observing the arrival of British reinforcements, adapted their tactics to account for the changed military situation. Rather than launching direct attacks that might expose their men to artillery fire, the colonial forces adopted a strategy of continuous harassment designed to exhaust British troops and inflict steady casualties while avoiding decisive engagement. With Percy's superior force, the fighting at Midway, modern-day Arlington, represented the bloodiest phase of the entire engagement, as colonial forces launched coordinated attacks against Percy's column while British soldiers fought house to house. Battles through the village streets. The urban terrain negated many advantages of British military discipline, while providing ample opportunities for colonial fighters to use their superior knowledge of local geography and buildings. British casualties during the Midway engagement included both military personnel and colonial civilians, as the fighting spread through residential areas where the distinction between combatants and non-combatants became increasingly blurred. These civilian casualties, while numerically small, had significant political implications for British policy in Massachusetts and other American colonies. According to military historians' analysis of the engagement, Percy's relief expedition demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of conventional European military doctrine when applied to American conditions. The British forces' superior organization and firepower prevented complete disaster, but could not achieve decisive victory against an enemy that refused to engage in traditional battlefield confrontations. The psychological impact of the day's fighting extended far beyond the immediate participants, as news of colonial military success against professional British forces spread throughout the 13 colonies. The engagement at Lexington and Concord had demonstrated that American resistance to British policy could take effective military form, transforming the nature of the imperial crisis from political protest to armed rebellion. As twilight approached on April 19, 1775, Brigadier General Hugh Percy's combined British force continued its desperate march toward the safety of Boston, pursued by colonial militia forces that seemed to grow stronger and more aggressive with each passing hour. The day that had begun with confident British assumptions about colonial military incompetence was ending with sobering lessons about the nature of warfare in America and the determination of the colonial population to resist imperial authority. The British column, now stretched over nearly a mile of country road, presented a tempting target for colonial marksmen who had perfected their tactics. During the long afternoon of fighting, stone walls, farmhouses, and forest clearings that had seemed picturesque during the morning march now concealed deadly threats that kept British soldiers in constant fear for their lives. The psychological pressure of fighting an enemy that could not be seen until the moment of attack was taking a severe toll on British morale and military efficiency. Percy's tactical skill in managing the withdrawal was evident in his use of artillery to clear suspected ambush positions and his deployment of light infantry companies to protect the column's flanks. These professional military measures prevented the complete collapse of British resistance, but could not eliminate the fundamental disadvantage of operating in hostile territory against an enemy that enjoyed overwhelming local support and intimate knowledge of the terrain. The engagement at Cambridge represented the final major action of the day, as colonial forces made a determined attempt to cut off the British retreat before it could reach the protection of naval artillery in Boston Harbor. The fighting in Cambridge streets was particularly intense, with British soldiers forced to clear houses and buildings while under constant fire from multiple directions. The urban warfare skills that colonial militia had developed during the French and Indian War proved invaluable in these close-quarters engagements. British casualties for the entire expedition eventually totaled 73 killed, 174 wounded, and 26 missing, representing nearly 15% of the force that had marched from Boston. These losses, while not catastrophic by European military standards, were shocking in the context of what had been planned as a routine police action against colonial troublemakers. The casualty figures provided stark testimony to the effectiveness of colonial resistance and the inadequacy of British intelligence about American military capabilities. Colonial losses were significantly lighter, with 49 killed and 39 wounded, despite their involvement in nearly continuous fighting throughout the day. This favorable casualty ratio reflected both the tactical advantages of fighting offensively in familiar terrain and the superior marksmanship skills that many colonial militia possessed. The disparity in losses would have important implications for future British military planning in America. As Percy's exhausted force finally reached the safety of British lines at Charlestown, the immediate military crisis was over, but the political and strategic implications of the day's fighting were just beginning to be understood. The engagement at Lexington and Concord had transformed the imperial crisis from a dispute over taxation and representation into an armed rebellion that would require military suppression on a scale that few British officials had previously contemplated. The news of fighting in Massachusetts spread rapidly throughout the 13 colonies, carried by the same communication networks that had summoned militia to resist the British expedition. Colonial newspapers provided detailed accounts of British atrocities at Lexington and Concord, while British officials struggled to explain how a routine military operation had escalated into open warfare against His Majesty's subjects. The strategic consequences of April 19, 1775, extended far beyond the immediate military results, as the engagement demonstrated that colonial resistance to British policy could take effective armed form. The shot heard round the world, fired on Lexington Common in the early morning darkness, had initiated a conflict that would ultimately involve European powers and reshape the political structure of North America. Captain John Parker and his surviving Lexington militiamen, bloodied but victorious in their first engagement with British regular forces, had participated in events that would inspire democratic movements throughout the Western world. The farmers, mechanics, and shopkeepers who had faced professional soldiers on Lexington Common and at Concord's north. Bridge had proven that citizens defending their rights and liberties could successfully resist the military power of the world's greatest empire. The American Revolutionary War had begun not with grand declarations or formal military campaigns, but with a small skirmish in a Massachusetts farming community, where ordinary people had decided that some principles were worth fighting for, regardless of the personal cost. The legacy of their courage would echo through centuries of human struggle for freedom and self-governance, making April 19, 1775, one of the most significant dates in the history of human liberty. References: historical details and tactical analysis drawn from David Hackett Fisher's Paul Revere's Ride, Oxford University Press, Arthur Tortellit's Lexington and Concord, W.W. Norton. Robert Gross's The Minutemen and Their World, Hill and Wong and Allen. French's The Day of Concord and Lexington, Little, Brown and Company.